I'm here today with Peter Solomon, who's the CEO and founder of Peter J. Solomon Company, one of the first private investment banks on the street. And Peter, cannot thank you enough for taking the time to sit down with me today. Really, really appreciate it. So we're talking to a man who, when he was in college, had no clue what he wanted to do. And obviously, he's done a lot of very impressive stuff. So, Peter, let's continue.
I had almost gone into the Carter administration. I was close to Jimmy Carter. And I had almost become chairman of the SEC before I had become deputy mayor. Carter actually almost appointed me, didn't, because he said, I can't appoint anybody from Wall Street. He didn't have enough nerve to do that. But I had remained very close ties to the Carter administration, which was a badly run administration. It was not good. Jimmy was not a great president. He was a very interesting man, but not a great president. But Stuart Eisenstadt, my dear friend, who continues to be a dear friend of mine, had wanted me to come to Washington. A number of others had. And Senator Moynihan had urged me to do this. And he said, listen, there'll never be another Democratic president. This is 1980. Right. He said, if you look at the demographics of the country, they're going west. There'll always be Republicans. You really should know more about government. You really should know about how Washington works. You really should know about the Treasury and the White House. So I want you to view going to Washington as a PhD, as if you're taking a PhD. And I hung up the phone and I said to myself, I think he's right. So I called my then wife, who was very tolerant, and said, whatever you want. And I called Pete Peterson, who was less happy. And I said, I know this sounds crazy, but I'm going to go to Washington, and I know he's going to lose, but I'm going anywhere. The election occurs. Carter gets beaten badly. I call Stuart Eisenstadt, and I say, would you mind if I went home? He said, go home. Anyway, I went back to Lehman Brothers. That was a mistake. I should have taken, and I advised somebody just yesterday, I should have taken 6 months off and thought a lot about what I wanted to do. I had really determined that I wanted to go in the LBO business. It was the beginning of the LBO business. We called them bootstrapping at Lehman Brothers. We had done a number of them. And I really should have, I proposed to Pete Peterson that I set up a firm jointly with Lehman Brothers. I should have thought more about what I was doing. But I had been in government over 3 years. Inflation was rampant, as you know. I was making $57,500. I didn't have any money. I had 3 kids, and I really was insecure about what was going on. It was a terrible economic period. At that time, and I just checked it, I believe I bought New York City short-term notes at 20%. So that gives you a sense of what the era was. Of course, Volcker eventually broke inflation, as we all know, but it was a very, very difficult period. New York City, we know, because it was on the verge of bankruptcy, but the city, Carter gave the famous malaise speech, which doomed him. It was a very, very tough period. So decision-making, I was then 43. If I had to do it again, and I tell this to people all the time, I would have taken 6 months.
So I love that advice. So in terms of taking 6 months off, that's something that you tell your children and young people today.
When you're making a job change, really look around. Really, that was a very important, I was 43, it was a very important period. And I knew I didn't want to continue in politics. I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do. Interestingly, it's always roads, paths unchosen. I'm not sure I was that interested in being an advisor. I mean, the irony of my life is 3 or 4 times I've tried to stop being an advisor, and I've always ended up being an advisor. And the reason for that is probably that I spend most of my life as an advisor, sometimes getting paid for it and sometimes not. I've managed to make a living from getting paid by people who I've advised in financial matters, but I've probably spent more of my time advising companies, entities, charities, politicians, friends, sons and daughters of friends in other non-paying capacities.
So you went back to Lehman Brothers and joined the investment banking group. What was that experience like?
Well, I was having a wonderful time, paying no attention to any of the politics of it, just doing business and really having a wonderful time. And then the firm began to collapse. Glucksman, the famous Greed and Glory, Ken Alette's famous book, The Fall of the House of Lehman, It was the beginning of the trader against banker phenomenon that went on for 20 years. Lou Glucksman was socially insecure and was at one point creating a lot of the income. Having said he created a lot of the income in '83, he had almost bankrupted the firm in '70, '71, '72 by imprudent and perhaps actually illegal actions, and had really endangered the partnership. But he was emboldened in the early '80s. Pete was thinking, I think, of leaving the firm anyway. And this whole saga has been recounted brilliantly by Canaletta. I was forced into the middle of it. There's a famous vote, a 14-to-1 vote, where I'm the only one voting against 14 of my partners in terms of accepting the deal between Peterson and Glucksman, because I thought it would destroy the firm. It destroyed the firm.
I was talking to Mark Patterson, and he attributed the Wall Street meltdown to the end of the partnerships, because when that occurred, obviously, the partners didn't have any stake in the game, if you will. It was other people's money.
Well, there were two issues. I've written about that. And I ascribe it to the 1981 going public of Salomon Brothers. And two issues happened. One, the firm's incorporated, so they had limited liability, and number two, they had other people's money so they could take more risk. There is no question, I've written about this for 34 years, there's no question that that was the moment that Wall Street changed. And it was Katie bar the door. I eventually left Shearson to get ahead of the story in 1989 by saying that I did not want to be responsible for neither my wealth nor my reputation, be responsible for dealing with people I really didn't know, trading securities I didn't understand, in time zones I rarely visited.
Right.
And if you just take that phrase, you will see what happened to Wall Street.
What do you think about Dodd-Frank and what the government has done with regard to regulation?
The problem of the meltdown was both the problem of the industry and a problem of the regulators. The regulators cannot keep up, will never keep up with the ingenuity of the industry. The industry will always be one step ahead of them. So you're just always waiting for your next financial crisis. The United States has always had financial crises. We have them every 20 or 30 years. Capitalism has financial crises. It's just the nature, it's a cost of capitalism. It's an unfortunate cost, but it is. What is Dodd-Frank doing? Well, I think they're striking at the right issue where they are today, which is they view banks, the government views banks, commercial banks, as utilities. They are to provide credit and liquidity. They're Con Ed. We want Con Ed to put on the lights. We want the banks to put on liquidity. So they're going to make the banks do that. So the banks the way to do that is to keep increasing the capital requirements. The banks are going to go back to the way banks were in the 1950s. They're going to lend money. They're going to be boring. They're going to have low return on equity. They're going to pay high dividends. That's what the government wants. I think the government's right. Yeah. Now, the only problem is that the government is, and it's not the government's fault, we're forcing the risk into the non-regulated area. So Dodd-Frank is going to do a better job of taking care of things it's regulating. It's certainly not perfect. I can't even write on Dodd-Frank because it's too complicated to even write on.
Sure.
But in general, the thrust is correct. The only sidebar is that it's pushed all the risk into the non-regulated field. That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a problem. So you're going to have financial fallout. But will you have failures of the Bank of America anymore, or J.P. Morgan? No. And how many banks will you have? Very few.
And do you still think it's just as exciting for a young person to go work on Wall Street today? Because obviously it's a lot different than when you started out in the business.
That's a wonderful question. When I created this in 1989, I saw, in response to your question, I saw what was going on at Wall Street. I saw that Wall Street, because of capital, limited liability, and the availability of public capital, would spend their life investing their capital. And they would not be giving advice anymore, and they would be creating these incredible conflicts. Instantly, I didn't know whether clients would know that they were being conflicted. And instantly, I'm still not sure they know they're being conflicted. I think Wall Street's going to go back to where it was. I think that the Evercores and those type of companies have done an excellent job, are going to morph into the Lehman Brothers and the Morgan Stanleys of the 1980, 30 years ago. I think the banks are going to go back to where they are. And I think the role for folks like ourselves is to be very, very, very good in advisory business. Everybody that you've interviewed talks about relationships, talks about this other stuff. It's all true, but you've got to be very good, and you've got to be you've got to be honest. You've got to know who your client is, and you've got to live and die by that client. Can Wall Street be exciting? Yeah, but most people, younger people, say the excitement is either in trading, hedge funds, activism this week, private equity. Advising is a very tough business, but it's a fun business if you like people. Yeah. It's like politics. It's like advising other people. It's like teaching. It's all part of the same thing, but you got to like it.
So Peter, there's one thing I got to ask you. You've built an incredible company here, and for every great company, we know what it's all about. It's all about the people. And you've done an amazing job hiring folks, as has every successful person and company. Tell us a little bit about what you look for in people. What attracts you to people and makes you feel, these folks have to work at Peter J. Solomon?
The basic line is integrity. I can't have any doubts about anybody's integrity. What I say to people here is that if there's any a breakdown in integrity, I'm going to fire you, and if I'm wrong, I'll apologize. I tell everybody we hire, it's the first thing I tell analysts. I said, if anything comes up, you're gone. Yeah. And I may have made a mistake, in which case I will be very upset and come to you and tell you I've done something, I've fired you incorrectly, but you're fired. So integrity is the, a client of ours the other day recommended us to somebody, and I called him and I said, what did you tell him? Did you tell him we were smart? He said, oh, God, no, I didn't tell him you're smart. Every investment bank is smart. I told him you're honest. Okay, so that's the beginning and the end, sine qua non. The next thing is just self-starting. You have to be self-starting, but you also have to like to sell. Being smart is sine qua non. Everybody's smart. But you have to like to sell. There's nothing gets done in this world unless somebody buys it. Otherwise, you're a tree falling in the forest. Who cares what your analysis is? You have to understand that. So what we look for is people who are self-starters and who like to sell, and they're very hard to find. All organizations have very few of those people.
So Peter, in terms of giving back, you've done an incredible job of giving back to various charities. You're on the board of Memorial Sloan Kettering. You're on the board of the Museum of Natural History and some other boards as well. Tell us a little bit about that.
There's always somebody richer than you are. But where you can be is more important by being involved in things, by running an institution. And importance in New York, in my view, is defined by your charitable involvement, not by your wealth.
So Peter, you've been invited back to Harvard to present to the graduating class. What sort of advice would you give kids today?
The first advice I would give them is the advice Harry Wolfson gave me. If you want to help the world, if you want to do something, be employed as a start. So my first thing is to get a job. My second thing to do is, as we say to them, you see what we've done for you, we expect you to do that for someone else.
Again, I'm here with Peter Solomon, who's the chairman and founder of Peter J. Solomon Company. Peter, cannot thank you enough for your time. I think your words of wisdom and advice are going to be extremely helpful. And again, thanks so much.
It's a pleasure to see you.